Okay, it is now 1:45, and so I resume the hearing. Mr. Lane.
Thank you, sir. I have similar concerns to other people around these tables in relation to the heritage assets such as individual listed buildings and the nature conservation assets. I understand that these factors are going to be influential on determining the greenbelt boundaries, but I'm unclear actually how they're to be applied, because I understand they're not determinative. There's nothing in the council's document that shows what effect they have on their decision. Turning to my more substantive points, sir, the first one I'd like to consider is the land that needs to be kept permanently open. And I note the council make a very bold statement that all of the greenbelt boundaries have been assessed, and as a matter of principle, they don't include any land that isn't necessarily to be kept permanently open. There's no evidence of that, sir. Rather, the evidence that we do have at CD 13 Annex K is to the contrary. There are a number of examples, and you won't be surprised when I say H28, sir, which CD 13 Annex K informs us was not taken forward by members. There's no indication that that site formed a greenbelt purpose. Also, ST13, sir, CD 13 Annex K informs us that that site was deleted because of an adverse impact on a suitable access. Again, no mention of its greenbelt purpose. And I'll be surprised that any of the sites that the council proposed to allocate for development in all of their iterations of their plans, whether any of those sites had any significant adverse impact of including land within the greenbelt. It would surprise me greatly if that was the case. So I think the council's paragraph 7.2.1 is, well, it's not correct, sir. Turning to the council's point regarding safeguarded land, I note paragraph 83 of MPPF 2012 says that refers to the land intended permanence in the long term and that they should be capable of enduring beyond the planned period. Paragraph 85 also indicates that the agreement boundaries will need to be will need to endure beyond the planned period and not need to be altered. So reflecting on paragraph 10.2, sir, and 10.3 of York's document CYC 59, here it states that the greenbelt boundaries will endure for at least 20 years. So the council understand the meaning of the NPPF 2012. However, we were also informed today, sir, that to ensure the greenbelt boundaries endure, that the council have allocated strategic sites which will be developed beyond the planned period 2032, 2033, up to 2037, and that it's legitimate for the council to look at such matters and make those allocations available after the end of the plan period. I accept that, so I think that's a legitimate response. However, yesterday, sir, we also found that the council won't have a 5-year housing land supply in 2031, 32, 32, 33. So it's unclear, sir, how the council will ensure that the boundaries won't be amended early. Further, sir, no one's mentioned it to date so far, but the council will need to review their plan in the short term, and in regard to that review, they will have to take into account the standard methodology, which will significantly increase the housing requirement. There is no acknowledgement within any of the council's documents how the council will accommodate that additional need within what will be at that point in time, so a permanent greenbelt, which should endure beyond the planned period. there is no flexibility in the council's plan, sir. Moving on to my last and final point, sir, which is quite long-winded. We have heard today that openness is important to the Greenbelt assessment made by the council. The document CY59 refers at various paragraphs 8.18 and 8.27, criteria 2, etc., to the impact on openness and openness of settings. The MPBF, I refer you to the MPBF paragraph 79, sir, which does refer to openness, but it's openness in the context of preventing urban sprawl. It does refer, sir, to one of the essential characteristics of the Greenbelt is openness, but I think it's my view, sir, that you have to read that in the context of preventing urban sprawl. But perhaps more significantly, paragraph 80, which defines the 5 purposes of including land within the Greenbelt, does not include a test of openness. It's quite clear from reading the council's document that just about every parcel of land that isn't in the urban area is regarded to form a openness function. I think, sir, that the council have started at the wrong starting point. Just because land is open does not mean, sir, that it fulfills a Greenbelt purpose. So I do have some concerns about the council's methodology, but I think, as Mr. Natkis said, I think these are matters that are capable of being resolved and found to be sound. It's just how the council have set out their approach in the first instance. Thank you, sir.
Just to make sure I understand the last point, Mr. Lane, are you in effect saying that openness as a concept is embedded within the 5 Greenbelt purposes rather than being something to consider separately?
My view is that openness is not one of the tests for defining the Greenbelt. Openness is something that, once you define the Greenbelt, openness as a concept is the land should remain open. It's not a purpose of, when defining the Greenbelt, it's not a purpose of that land, that site, it's got to be judged against openness. It's got to be judged against the 5 purposes set out in paragraph 80. If that makes sense, sir.
I understand, thank you. Is it Mr. Hargreaves?
Thank you, sir. Michael Hargreaves for York Travellers Trust. 2 quick points. And firstly, I just want to sort of say something quickly about the difficulty of not having any safeguarded land in terms of the implication, the consequences and likely conflicts which will flow from that in the medium term, and the conflict with para 85 of the 2012 MPPF of not needing to alter the boundary at the end of the period. In a previous life, I spent a lot of time concerned with the consequences of a tight greenbelt boundary around a city, Cambridge, with a dynamic economy but no remaining safeguarded land. The message from that experience is that not providing significant safeguarded land near to the built-up area is fundamentally difficult to reconcile with sustainable development principles. Fairly obvious, but it needs to be said, yeah? What will happen when you get to that situation is that you'll have significant struggles to release land from the inner boundary, and that much of the development will be pushed beyond the outer boundary with a resultant significant increase in long-distance car commuting. Not very sustainable. My second point returns to York and its gypsies. York Traveller Trust will follow up your suggestion, sir, of a discussion around their concerns with the council before the later phases of the examination, with view to agreeing a statement of common ground. We've tried to initiate that discussion a number of times, but it has never happened for some reason. Central to those concerns is our belief that Policy H5, as drafted, is unworkable. One of the requirements, in our view, for it to be workable is allocations on land not included within the Green Belt. The amounts of land involved are very small, but you need some of those allocations. You also need to understand what types of traveller sites are required. Again, something to which the council has given, from what I can see, absolutely no consideration whatsoever. We've consistently made the point that two types of sites are required: social rented and privately provided, and that their site requirements are different. The situation in York is, in many ways, exceptional compared with the national position, in that all of its authorised provision is on social rented sites. Government policy, planning policy for traveller sites, para 4C, makes it clear that the
I know this is frustrating for you, Mr. Hargreaves, but can I ask you to confine yourself to issues directly, and I mean really directly, about the Green Belt boundary?
Yeah.
Not because we won't discuss them, we will have thorough discussions. Yeah. In fact, there's a bit of a danger, really, if you scattergun stuff across different sessions, the point kind of gets lost. So,
I understand that, sir. I've nearly finished. I just want to make one final point. York is exceptional. All of its provision is on 3 public sector sites. Nationally, practically all of the growth in the last 20 years has been on private sites, and now over 2/3 of accommodation for gypsies is on privately provided sites. The sort of sites which are most suitable for private provision are in urban fringe or village fringe locations for perhaps 2 to 5 pitches, possibly associated with keeping horses. For whatever reasons, gypsy people have not been able to secure such sites around York, and the more successful entrepreneurial gypsies, who are often the type of people I've worked for, have been driven out of York. It may be that some of the landowners have land a little away from urban extensions or the like, which could provide this type of site for travellers to develop themselves, and that's what the demand is for. We'd be happy to talk to their representatives about how this type of provision could be made to work. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Keogh.
Thank you, sir. So I just want to touch on a few points. I'm heading towards question 7.2, but just to put a bit of context on that. So I'd like you to consider the political context in which the decision on Green Belt boundaries was made when the plan was submitted in May 2018. And it's important to remember, the reason I raise this, of course, is because the decision to submit the plan to the Secretary of State is ultimately a political decision. It's made by members. So I think it's important to consider what was influencing their decision-making, what information did they have before them when they made that decision. And it's clear, sir, and the position was finally rectified in your letter in June 2020, but in our view, we've touched on this earlier in the week, the decisions on Greenbelt boundaries and the decisions on development needs were made in the context of having to prove exceptional circumstances to release land from the Greenbelt. And others have touched on this earlier. I'd agree with their views that that was the incorrect basis on which decisions were made. Sir, when we discussed this earlier in the week, I couldn't point to anything within printed minutes of local plan working groups meetings that refer to the exceptional circumstances. But certainly in the meetings that I attended, the local plan working group meetings, up to the submission of the plan, and others I'm sure as well will remember this, there was certainly a view amongst members that they were trying to minimise release of land from the Greenbelt. And I've come across a press article I saved from 2015, and the date, sir, it's around June 2015, I haven't got the precise date, it was a front page article in the York Press. And so it's in 2015, in the period between the withdrawal of the draft 2013 plan, which, as you have been told, had much greater provision for development needs. It also identified safeguarded land. It also had a higher housing requirement. And when new political leadership came in, they decided to take a different view, as they're quite entitled to do. I'm not making any political points here. I'm just trying to give you a view of how the decisions relating to the plan changed over time. So the decision was taken to remove safeguarded land from the plan and reduce housing requirement. And that ultimately fed into decisions later on in the process, particularly in relation to the January 2018 Local Plan Working Group meeting, which I've referenced previously, where members were strongly advised by officers to make greater provision for development needs in order to produce a more sound plan. And so the article I've managed to turn up from 2015 the context was the council were looking at that time as to how they could meet the housing needs of York without releasing land from the Greenbelt. And they were looking at trying to meet some of that need in adjoining districts. And the other districts were pushing back on that. And this press article was reporting on that debate between the councils. But at that point, sir, in June 2015, the leader of York Council said, "We really want to preserve the Greenbelt and we don't have room for more houses." So my point, sir, is that when members then came to make decisions on the shape of the local plan, and particularly when they were advised to increase the land for development needs in 2018, that was the underlying advice or the thinking that the context in which they were operating. The need to preserve the Greenbelt and the need for exceptional circumstances to release land from the Greenbelt. So your letter of 2020 obviously makes it clear that these exceptional circumstances are not appropriate context in this situation. And we made the same representations in our submission since 2016. So the point really is that, as others have said, we're not releasing land from the Greenbelt. We're asking what land should not be included so that we can meet development needs. And that leads me on to the second point, so which is, again, the safeguarding point, which is fundamentally the Council have not properly considered paragraph 85 and bullet point 3 relating to safeguarded land and the need to safeguard land for development needs well beyond the plan period. And the Council had advice on this, sir, from the QC then advising them in 2016, and this was actually quoted in the Preferred Sites Consultation document, July 2016, page 14, under paragraph 2.5 Greenbelt. And so what that consultation document says is, Council's latest advice on the issue of Greenbelt permanence, John Hobson QC, January 2015, refers to NPPF guidance, in particular the need for consideration to be given to the development needs of the area, both within the plan period and the longer term. If land is left within the Greenbelt, that would be, I think there's a comma missing here, if land is left within the Greenbelt, that would be contrary to the overriding requirement of permanence, because it is known that further development land will be needed to meet future development needs. So that was the advice that the council had when they were setting greenbelt boundaries up to the point of the submission plan. That raises another interesting point, which I'm not sure we want to go on to today, maybe consider later, which is what now is the plan period? Because we're 5 years into the plan period, and if the plan is not adopted, let's say till next year, that'll be 6 years into the plan period, and we now can see that some of the strategic sites within the local plan will not be delivering houses until 10 years into the plan period. So if the plan was to be adopted, let's say next year, with an end date of 2032-33, it would in effect be a 10-year plan, and 5 years beyond that would give you a 15-year greenbelt boundary. That's clearly, in our view, not an adequate permanent greenbelt boundary, and we're clearly not setting greenbelt boundaries that will endure well beyond the plan period. So in relation to question 7.2, we would say that the plan does include land that should be kept open because the development needs have not been properly accounted for. Your letter of 2020 gave the council the opportunity to revisit the greenbelt boundaries in the context of development needs, in essentially a policy of context. In other words, not having to show exceptional circumstances. And a lot has changed since the submission of the plan in 2018. Strategic sites delivery has been pushed back, as I've just said. And that changes, therefore, the ability of the plan to adequately meet all of the housing needs of the city within the plan period. Because, of course, many of those strategic sites are key to the delivery of family housing and affordable housing. This clearly has implications for the land that is required in the plan period. And other sites that could fill the gap left by some of the strategic sites in the early years of the plan period could therefore be considered if the exceptional circumstances rule is not followed. And I'll just make this point in relation to things have changed. So since we've made our representations in 2018, my clients are now in discussion with the Joseph Rowntree Housing Trust, who are looking for opportunities to continue the work they've been doing for the last 100 years in providing last 100 years in delivering affordable housing in the city. The site at Derwentthorpe, which the trust were heavily involved in, is almost built out, and they're just looking for opportunities for new opportunities for development, but they're clearly constrained because many of the ST sites and other housing sites already have developers on board, and there are very few other opportunities around the city because of how tight the greenbelt is drawn. And in this context, I think this is where, picking up on Mr. Hargreaves' point, the lack of safeguarded land will clearly be a huge constraint to opportunities such as that we're looking at with the Joseph Rowntree Housing Trust coming forward in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Keogh. Mr. Linus, do you want to come back at this point?
I'll ask Mr. Wood first of all if he's got anything to say, and then I'll add any further points.
Just to go back to some previous points from Mr. Natkus, really just in terms of clarifying one or two things. I think it's come up a number of times in terms of landmark monuments. I think just to maybe make this point already, that in terms of the heritage topic paper, there are examples set out in there, but it isn't a comprehensive list. It is set out as examples, so the local assessment work that's undertaken following the detailed assessment questions allows you to look more broadly at that principal characteristic. There's a specific point, made around the nature of the historic city. So there's a point made that the historic city really should be seen as just the area of the city within the city walls. I think really I just point to the evidence base, particularly the heritage topic paper, and really in terms of that clearly York's character, his historic character, and importantly its setting extends beyond that central area, and we've been talking about the relationship with the countryside and the surrounding area, so it clearly goes well beyond that, and the evidence-based documents set that out, and I think probably most of the purposes of Greenbelt would be probably rendered not relevant if we were just totally looking just at the area within the city walls. And I think on the other points, in terms of the approach we've been through, in terms of the methodology takes you through an approach that requires you to assess land as to whether it meets Greenbelt purposes, and that's the way in which it's determined whether land serves those purposes and is included within the Greenbelt. I think I'd be repeating points from earlier today otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I think fundamentally Mr. Natker accepted that there wasn't any sort of fundamental flaw in approach. It was really a question of looking at this in the context of certain sites. I suspect he'd be able to identify at least one where he wants to raise some issues. And in that context, there isn't really much more to say other than to explain that any complaint about the boundaries being tightly drawn is really a matter to be debated at a later stage. He made a point about how the council has dealt with urban sprawl under the first purpose. I think as the addendum recognises, if you have land that is close to the existing built-up area, as he accepts as inevitable, their judgment is going to have to be reached about the contribution that makes to preventing urban sprawl, and land which is near to the built-up area is obviously going to make a significant contribution as a matter of principle and at a high level when one's considering that purpose. But the council has moved beyond that and assessed individual boundaries in a way which will be considered at a later stage. As far as Mr. Lane is concerned, I think he was really repeating the point about heritage assets, listed buildings, and nature conservation assets that I think we've explained. Again, it's something that can be dealt with as part of individual boundary sessions, but we haven't simply drawn a boundary based purely on individual assets, individual historic assets, without considering that in the context of purpose 4 more generally. As for safeguarded land, I don't want to go into this in too much detail because it starts moving into some supply issues that have already been considered, but in section 10 of the addendum, the overall approach of the council is explained, which acknowledges that there is essentially a headroom between the supply that is being provided for through the plan and the calculation of the housing requirement, which can then be taken into account in order to reach a judgment about whether or not the Greenbelt boundaries that are adopted on the basis of that supply will be enduring, or in the terms of the policy would allow for permanence to be achieved, so that Greenbelt boundaries will not need to be altered at the end of the development plan period. That's ultimately a matter of judgment. There's nothing in the policy which identifies a particular time period beyond the end of the plan which needs to be applied when reaching that judgment. But we say that the headroom, as explained in section 10, is sufficient to mean that permanence can be achieved and that allocations can achieve that without the need for safeguarding. As for Mr. Hargreaves, I think with respect, Mr. Hargreaves is covering issues of gypsy and traveller need, which, as you've identified, sir, we'll come back to later. As for Mr. Keogh, there isn't really much to say about the political context in which previous decisions of the council have been taken. The fundamental point is that there's nothing in the documentation before you now, including the addendum, to suggest that the council has been applying the exceptional circumstances test as far as the boundaries it's now presenting to you are concerned. It has set out the methodology which is based on Greenbelt purposes, as well as ensuring consistency with the local plan strategy as it is. And as we've explained, that takes on board your conclusions on the fact that there's no need to demonstrate exceptional circumstances, and we stand over the boundaries as they've been assessed.
Thank you. Mr. Willis.
Thank you, sir. I'll try and keep this brief, just to point out that we agree with the points made on the methodology in terms of heritage assets and retrofitting, etc. Also, that there are many sites which do not fill the role of Greenbelt. I'm not going to dwell on those points other than to draw you to our statement at paragraph 2.17 and previous representations on that. My greater Greenbelt concern at the moment relates to a question which was asked earlier in the week on spatial strategy at that point in time. And the question of that earlier in the week was, where is the housing going to go in the future? I think it's all well and good to say that the strategic allocations provide beyond the plan period, but what we already know in terms of standard method and under delivery and everything else, that there is a huge unmet need looking beyond this plan period in York, and I simply do not see where it's going to go. I don't believe for 1 minute that the Greenbelt boundaries will endure beyond the plan period. Now, I think drawing that to a close, that puts you in a very difficult position for how you progress the plan. There were suggestions last week of an immediate plan review policy, which I said last week I can see the merits of. I have doubts as how it would work. I think my concern with it is that as soon as you insert such a policy, you immediately accept that actually the Greenbelt policies aren't fit for purpose and don't go beyond the plan period. The only way in which I can see you could overcome that is to make an allowance for safeguarded land now. I think that would be an appropriate way to deal with the plan. There are many sites which could be inserted as safeguarded land, and I would like to think would provide everyone with a way forward with this plan. But yeah, that's all for now, sir. Thank you.
Just on the safeguarded land point, Mr. Willis, what period of need do you think that such safeguarded land should cover plan-wide?
I think, as has been said, there's no clear definition within any version of the framework. It does say beyond the plan period. My interpretation of beyond the plan period is that you would be starting a new plan review, and as that next plan review, you would, my understanding of the council's position is that the next plan review would not need to change Greenbelt boundaries. I just don't see that that's a reasonable point to take at this stage.
I suppose what I'm getting at is if we were to agree with you, how would we go about establishing how much safeguarded land there might need to be?
That's a very difficult question, and probably comes down to some extent as to what the agreed need is, both in this plan period and giving thought to future plan periods, which clearly we don't know definitively. But
do we have any idea of what the need might be beyond this plan period?
Well, I think
when looked at in the future,
you can have a reasoned estimation on it by looking at standard method. We know that any future plan review would be based on a different methodology to that now. So I think that there's a reasonable starting point there. There's not a definitive figure, but
it'll be a different method to the one used here, but it might not be the standard method.
Agreed.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Willis. Mr. Tucker.
Yes, sir. I had a very small procedural point to pick up from this morning, although I'm tempted to just answer your last question, if I may, sir. So if you're looking for a period, there's been a number of different local planning inspectors that have looked at different ones, from a sort of fudged approach in East Cheshire of you need at least some, to others that have said 15 years plus 5 years at the end, which gives you a logic in terms of the 5-year land supply issue. And the Secretary of State used to say, way back in the early 13th century when I started, it was 2.5 plan periods that you should be looking for in terms of the endurance of the Greenbelt. So you need enough safeguarded land for that, which gives you 25 years. But some, I think, is the answer. And at the moment, there's none. That wasn't why I put my Toblerone up. So I put my Toblerone up because I'm reminded, of course, that I don't just act for York University, I act for 3 other institutions. And in terms of statements of common ground in respect of need, and I'm stressing particularly the tertiary education institutions, I am instructed to say that we are very keen to have those dialogues with the City Council behind the scenes with a view to agreeing the same sort of thing as we are with the university. For example, Askham Bryan College is tied up in terms of the Bio-Yorkshire approach, which the university is also tied up with, which you will have seen from our evidence base is a huge project for technological improvements related to agricultural issues. So we make that offer through you, sirs, to the authority in the hope that that can at least be discussed in advance of, what are we now, stage 3 of the plan coming up in the summer. I assume that that would be sensible, sir.
I see you nodding, sir. I'll take that away, take instructions on that, but I'm also receiving nods from behind, so I think Mr. Tucker can assume that we accept that as the appropriate way forward.
Thank you, Mr. Linus.
Yeah, it's not just an appropriate way forward, it's a necessary way forward. And frankly, Mr. Griffiths and I are sitting here wondering why this hasn't happened before. This is very late in the day, and as a consequence of that, the more effort that can go into it and the more detail that there can be in the statement of common ground, both about agreed areas and unagreed areas, then the better from our perspective.
Yes, sir, that's understood. Of course, we're here to help you both, and as I said, in relation to the university, the timetable for that will be hopefully to agree a statement of common ground that will then allow any hearing statements that address any areas of disagreement to be drafted on an informed basis so that all parties, including yourselves, know well in advance of the hearings where we are.
I'm very grateful for my learned friend's indication in relation to that, and we'll obviously try and progress things behind the scenes as much as we possibly can. I have to say it's slightly ironic that I'm looking at my learned friend with a backdrop of a huge sign saying a new life and a new beginning. Maybe it is a new beginning in terms of the approach of the City Council. If so, I'm grateful. I'll ignore the messianic bits behind my learned friend.
Mr. Corsier.
Thank you, sir. I just want to come back on Mr. Linus's response to me. I'll do it very quickly. So, in terms of heritage assets, can I just basically take you to 3.2 of the questions? I think, just as an example, I'm using this as an example, sir. And it's quite clear this is the question the Council's asked itself.
My apologies.
3.2, page 75, sir, of the addendum.
Yeah, under criterion 3, landscape and setting.
Yes, sir. It says, does the land need to remain permanently open to aid the understanding of significance for the situation of a designated landscape park or garden? It's quite clear, sir, that is dealing with the setting of that individual landscape park or garden. It's just a matter of common English, sir. He's not asking, does that contribute to the overall setting of the historic town, sir? That is a question solely concerned with setting of the registered garden. And the same point applies, sir, to landscape monuments. So, sir, I think Mr. Linus is slightly misleading. I think this is a bit of retrofitting the argument, sir. This is how the Council have actually applied the methodology. I think they've moved their position now for the purpose of this examination because they've realised there's been a fault in their reasoning. So in terms of the extent of changes, sir, and Mr. Linus quoted the figure 0.7%, so that's not really relevant to you, I suggest. We give you a list of changes. You'll obviously have them yourself on the composite modifications, but they include some very major changes. I'll give you just 2 examples, sir. The retreat site next to York University, between York University and the barracks, sir, in Val Barrack, sir. That major brownfield site has now been excluded from the Greenbelt with the potential for around 300 to 400 dwellings, I would estimate. So another example, so the whole of Heslington Village has now been excluded from the Greenbelt. It previously washed over. These are very major changes, and it's quite very clear that a new methodology has been adopted to justify it. So can I just correct a point about field work? What I was actually saying, I think Mr. Lyons misunderstood what I was saying in terms of field work. I agree there's been new field work. In effect, what seems to have happened is the council has gone out since submission, sir, and basically done a full review on the ground of the Greenbelt boundaries. That is a new study of the type which you actually said they shouldn't do in your letter of, I think it was June 2020. And so, can I just deal with views? Again, I think slightly misrepresented here, sir. What Mr. Lyons was referring to was the central core conservation appraisal, sir. Of course, some of the landscape monuments are in the central core, but so we do know, and I refer you to page 57 of the Heritage Topic paper, that there are important views of monuments which are not in the central core, which are referred to there. And indeed, there are views out from the urban area, and particularly from the ring road, sir, which would also not be picked up on in the central core appraisal of views. So we do say to you that essential exercise has been missing. And so that's not only our view, it's also the council's view, because they specifically say, for example, in relation to ST15, there needs to be a full appraisal of views. So that's acceptance, sir, in the HIA. And so just dealing with strategic allocations, this point, it's very difficult, sir, without taking you to the document with a particular example to show you what the council's actually done. But I think it will be common ground. The question's only been addressed to the boundary proposed, and that's without the strategic site. The strategic site has not been addressed. Those questions have not been addressed to the strategic sites with the exception of the new settlements. So I would ask you to have a look at the document yourself to confirm that. And that's all I want to say, sir. Thank you.
Mr. Cursier, can I ask? I do this with a little trepidation because experience tells me that once you start delving into questions of setting of heritage assets, you often set yourself a task which might last days or weeks. So I want to put this quite shortly, and it addresses a number of other points that have been made. Isn't what we're talking about here caused by the fact that settings of assets overlap often? So the setting of a monument might overlap with the setting of an historic city. So if the council is said to be considering the setting of an individual asset as important for assessing whether land should be put into the Greenbelt, aren't they at the same time considering the special character and setting of an historic city? Is it not just an overlapping exercise?
No, sir. My view would be that there is a distinction between setting of a historic town, which is purpose for, sir, and the setting of individual listed buildings or conservation areas or heritage assets. you would need to you need to distinguish between the it would be very important that you distinguish between the two, sir. And, for example, there could be open land around a listed building, so, which is important to remain open. That is not a reason why it should go in the greenbelt. I appreciate the force where you're trying to say there could be overlaps, sir, but that isn't whether or not a building forms part of the setting, whether a piece of open land forms part of a setting of a particular heritage asset is not a reason, or it is not even a question you should ask yourself when considering the setting of the town overall. What is clearly important, sir, is that settings of monuments such as Terry's or the racecourse or the Minster, they are clearly very, very important. They should be protected. Indeed, there should be protection of views out towards the Wolds or the Howardian Hills. Those are very important features which go to the setting of York as a historic town. But I think the council misdirects itself if it asks itself, does that piece of land form part of a setting of an individual heritage asset?
That's a helpful explanation. I don't want to prolong the conversation for obvious reasons, but I'm happy with that.
Just checking Mr. Kersey had finished. Do you have anything?
Just to come in briefly on this point about views, and I think it's similar to the landmark monuments, there are examples and key examples for York set out in the heritage topic paper, and they are drawn on in doing the assessment exercise at the annexes. I think from a perspective of views, and it's really the heritage topic paper is driving the approach that is then done through the annexes and in the actual assessment work, that you need to actually sort of be on site and assess what there is and draw on all the different evidence-based documents and see what views there are. I think to go beyond doing the views that's been done for the Central Historic Core, I think it would probably be an endless exercise that you would be undertaking in terms of trying to establish all of the views across the city. So I think it's a realistic approach that we take the guidance from the heritage topic paper on key ones, but when you're out on site and you're looking at boundaries and looking at these issues, you're very mindful of that from the evidence and from your site work to then identify those, assess those and see if they're relevant and take them into account rather than trying to see that there should be one study that does all of this and sets absolutely everything out. I think it would be an endless study that would need to be undertaken. Thank you.
And just to pick up on a couple of other points which appeared to be touching on safeguarding, I think the council has set out the approach that it has taken and allowed for headroom in the supply, reaching a judgment as to how far beyond the plan period should be catered for. Insofar as points are made about whether being a huge unmet need or needing to safeguard land instead, I think your point, sir, was a good one in the sense that adopting the standard methodology as a basis for that is not a secure approach because one does not know now exactly what is going to happen. So the approach that's been taken by the council, which is to indicate the supply having regard to the requirement as it stands and allowing for headroom to achieve permanence, we say is a reasonable approach to what is ultimately a question of judgment. As far as Mr. Kersey's points are concerned, again, he's sort of parsing very closely particular aspects of the assessment without sort of reading the document as a whole. I mean, on page 75 of the document, having moved away from landmark monuments, he picks up on a particular question relating to landscape and setting and the reference to designated landscape parks or gardens in 3.2. But if you see that in the context of the key question that's being asked, which is does the land need to be kept permanently open as part of the wider landscape associated with the historic character and setting of York? So And then the question 3.1, does the land need to remain permanently open to aid the understanding of the historical relationship of the city to its hinterland, particularly as perceived from open approaches? And the previous paragraphs in the lead up to that criterion, paragraphs 828 through to 830, clearly identify how landscape setting around York is being treated as part of the wider application of Purpose 4. So one can't take the specific reference to designated landscape and say, well, we're only looking at drawing boundaries by reference to designated landscapes alone. A proper application of the question suggests that there are broader questions being considered, and it may be that aiding the understanding or significance of a designation assists in allowing you to answer the broader question, but it's not being treated as a definitive. As for other points, the reference to field work, I mean, it's almost as if Mr. Kersey is complaining that we've actually gone out onto the field and checked whether the judgments that were reached before can be maintained following the application of the new methodology. It was entirely right that the Council did so, and it has led to some amendments, some of which were actually prompted by conclusions that were reached in your original letter, sir, particularly about Hessington. So we have sought to correct the boundary to ensure consistency of approach when the methodology is applied across the boundary as a whole, also to pick up on decisions that might have taken place since earlier boundary setting exercises were undertaken. As for views, as Mr. Wood has explained, views will generally have been taken into account when one is adopting the criteria as a whole, but in any event, the compactness criterion is identified in the heritage topic paper. It doesn't simply look at views into the historic core, it looks at views out. And so far as he refers to ST15 in the HIA saying a full appraisal of views is required, that shouldn't be taken to mean that the exercise carried out in the HIA simply sort of ignored views. It's simply suggesting, as you would with any case, that an appraisal of views is inevitably going to be required at a later stage as development comes forward. It doesn't mean that there's been no consideration given to the green belt purposes or views as part of any assessment of ST15. So I think those are all the points I wanted to add beyond Mr. Wood.
Mrs. Worthington.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to try and keep this short and not go over the bits that we've submitted in our evidence and avoid the strategic sites and avoid any specific site allocation comments.
Perfect.
It's clearly really important at this stage of the York local plan to define the green belt properly. As part of that, it's really important that we don't include sites that are not required within the green belt and don't fulfil the 5 green belt purposes. And not including those sites will help the longevity of the established boundaries. It's also important to consider the sites which have a green belt value at the current time. I'm not suggesting we need to get into exceptional circumstances, but in defining sites for development, we need to consider whether one field fulfills a green belt purpose and the next field doesn't or not. So it's important to actually understand the quality of those sites in relation to the green belt. Mr. Wood was very helpful in identifying the allocations are driven by the heritage topic paper, and that's confirmed on page 86 of topic paper 1, paragraph 9.16, which goes into the appraisal of impact of development on greenbelt purposes, and says it's going to appraise the impact of potential sites against the spatial strategy. Second one is appraise the impact of potential sites against the principles of the heritage topic paper and within the sustainability appraisal. And thirdly, defining a clear defensible boundary, applying the boundary methodology against greenbelt purposes. So that's what the council have said they've done in the topic paper. But what they've actually done, they haven't understood the importance of the value of land before it's allocated. I think this is a point similar to Mr. Corsier's making. The study that they've done identifies or seeks to justify boundaries which have already been determined by other means because of the need for development, rather than considering the greenbelt purposes in relation to that site. If you actually look at the proper greenbelt purposes in that land, it's then possible to balance that against the other needs set out by the council, such as the impact on the importance of the character and setting of York, the need for sustainable development, and the needs for sites to accommodate growth. This hasn't been done in a logical manner at the present time, and the council's evidence actually underlines the fact that it hasn't been carried out in that logical approach. There might be a way of sorting that out, but at the present time the evidence provided by the council doesn't set that out properly. Thank you very much.
Mr. Collard.
Thank you, sir, for the opportunity. I've been listening patiently and hearing everyone's thoughts, so I'll also try and be focused to points of methodology here, sir. We've heard a number of answers to some of these questions already, but I'd like to really mainly focus on 7.1c and really the differences from what you had before and what you've got now, and make some comments on that. Obviously, you've one of the key changes is the council say the removal of spatial shapers, and you've heard a debate as to whether the council has actually done that, and residual references to heritage assets and their setting. So really, sir, you have to be confident in your mind that the council has fully cleansed the document, if you like, of those references in as far as they relate to purpose 4. So we would say that in terms of that point. The second key difference is the introduction of these 19 questions relating to 3 of the 5 purposes of the Greenbelt. And as a result of all that, we've had 43 changes to the Greenbelt boundaries as a result of the proposed modifications. That's EXCYC 58, pages 34 to 75. That catalogues all the changes to the Greenbelt, and that there are a number around this table that would suggest that more changes will still need to be made to ensure the plan is sound on that basis. So, sir, it's for you also to consider whether the council has gone beyond what you originally asked them for in producing a new assessment versus just clarifying their methodology. I just want to make 2 specific points about the approach the council has taken. One relates to the 5th purpose, which hasn't been mentioned today, of the Greenbelt in relation to existing brownfield sites. And the council's approach has been that they've referenced it in the Greenbelt assessment, paragraph 5.8 of EXCYC 59, and they in effect say this, the setting of the boundary or the purpose 5 is considered to be achieved through the overall effect of the York Greenbelt rather than through the identification of particular parcels of land which must be kept permanently open, and so on. So in effect, the Greenbelt boundaries as set out, that in effect would support that purpose. But it doesn't necessarily mean that, so if the drawing up of boundaries will automatically enable that. Because if you do have a brownfield site and part of it is the other side of the boundary, it doesn't particularly work. So it's important, and you know, we say we've got issues with the boundary. We've got 2 examples of brownfield sites, and the boundary is drawn sort of cuts them off. So how has that purpose been considered? It hasn't been considered in the methodology at the start, but we say it's important that it is considered when the boundaries are actually drawn. They don't sort of carve up a site that's a brownfield site, otherwise they might miss some of that purpose, or achieving that purpose 5. And one approach would be to say, well, actually, yeah, it might warrant a consideration in its own right and other criteria, but we don't want to overcomplicate it. And another way of looking at it is actually making sure the boundaries are drawn correctly, and that's a phase 3 matter, I would suggest, sir, that we can come on to when we look at the detailed boundaries. But I think it's an important point to make, because brownfield sites, you know, there's probably a number of them, and you don't want the boundary going cut across them when we say, you know, a different alignment should be drawn. And I think in phase 3 that issue can be addressed, but it's important to raise that now. And we have 2 examples of that, Queen Elizabeth Barracks and Infield Barracks, where that boundary has been drawn, we would say, through some of those brownfield sites. So we think it's important to note that. And at the moment, the council has taken an unsound approach, and it can correct that in phase 3. Just a brief point then in terms of the 19 questions. We think in some ways it's an overcomplication of actually getting to, you know, the bottom of assessing Greenbelt boundaries and the purposes. And I don't want to say too much here, but just to say we've made a comment in our reps about the starting point for the first 3 criteria is, you know, almost starts from the position of saying the land is open already, when the land might not be, particularly if it's brownfield land. So that's a query we had. Have they used the right starting point there? I don't want to go into repeated points about, you know, the special, you know, villages and the special character of historic towns. I think that point has been made, so I'll move on from that. But just finally, what you have in the Greenbelt assessment is no real clear explanation as to how the answers enable the council to form conclusions, and it's not clear whether certain parts of the boundary are absolutely fundamental to the Greenbelt purpose compared to other boundaries as well. Other assessments and considerations might indicate that certain boundaries or areas have a very significant impact. It might be encroachment, urban sprawl, or whatever else, and we say that that's an important point. Finally, and it's sort of edging into point D, and I think this will finish up my points, sir, is really how the council has considered promoting sustainable patterns of development, and the point has already sort of been mentioned, but the council's boundaries have changed about 3 times in relation to land at Strenshill, particularly around Queen Elizabeth Barracks. And we say, and the council has at the submission and stage of the plan considered this location to be a sustainable location, and the boundaries at submission, in our view, are sound, and it's based on a sustainable position. Obviously, we need to. This is more for phase 3, and I won't go there, sir. But I just want to be clear that actually we think, you know, it is a sustainable location. The council, obviously for other reasons that have influenced them, have removed the site, and the Greenbelt boundary has almost followed suit. But now we've got a bit of a hybrid approach in the latest iteration, and we say in terms of Greenbelt on its own merit, we say, actually, sir, this is a sustainable location as evidenced by EXCYC 59F, Annex 4, 260. It comments on the sustainability of Strenshill, But I won't go into the detail here, sir, and I think you don't want me to go through every boundary here. So we'll leave that for later. But I think it's an important point to make that, you know, we don't think they have, the current position is sound in that regard. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. My apologies. I can't see the name on your nameplate. Mrs. Winter.
Thank you. It's just really to concur with a couple of the points that have already been raised really around the table with regards to safeguarded land providing some additional flexibility to the plan. Obviously, I appreciate the comments that have been raised by the council with regards to there being headroom in the supply that we were provided with yesterday. But obviously, there are a couple of queries over that were raised, and obviously there's also the fact that the supply does drop later within the plan period. I think it's during 2032 and 2033 where it drops below 5 years. And I also appreciate the point that post 2038 there is housing to come forward on some of the strategic sites. I think there's 3 strategic sites that are identified within that trajectory. But for sake of argument, if we are looking at housing requirement that is 822 per year, you times that by 5 to get the 5-year supply, which is 4,110. The trajectory shows that there's 2,524 units that are beyond the plan period. So broadly speaking, that equates to a 3.7-year supply beyond the plan period. Now, I know obviously we have mentioned that there isn't a time period in terms of a judgment as to, with regards to how long that safeguarded land should have. But obviously only a 3-year supply beyond the plan period plus a period later in the plan where we're dropping below 5 years does cause concern with regards to the flexibility of that plan and where the development's going to go in terms of the points that were previously raised around the table. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm very sorry. It's Mrs. Hubbard, isn't it?
Yes, thank you. Mrs. Winters just said quite a lot of what I was going to say, so I can miss that out. Certainly, I do see the absence of safeguarded land as providing a straitjacket rather than giving... It might give certainty, but it's a bad sort of certainty. It provides a straitjacket for development in the future, takes away options. Who knows, for example, what strategic requirements will be in 25 years, working from home, new transport initiatives, etc., let alone making provision for to meet currently identified needs. As to the amount of safeguarded land, which was an issue you mentioned, it could be argued that all land not necessary to be included in the Greenbelt to meet any of the Greenbelt purposes should be safeguarded. Alternatively, the whole lot can be left as white land unallocated to provide options for growth in the future. Again, I just endorse the other comments that Mrs. Winter made on the issue of safeguarded land. One or two other bits and pieces. I agree with the point Mr. Johnson made right at the beginning of the session this morning, that the Council still has a mindset that this plan is taking land out of the Greenbelt. And it's just worth noting what successive Secretary of States have said on appeal relating to land on the periphery of the built-up area, and a sentence which is more or less word for word repeated in numerous appeal decisions is that pending determination of detailed Greenbelt boundaries in an adopted local plan, that's the Secretary of State, see no reason why the site should not be treated as if it were in the Greenbelt. That's a very different position from the land being in the Greenbelt and being taken out.
It's always nice when inspectors are consistent.
It's practically word for word. It's appeared in numerous appeal decisions over decades, and people around this table will have their own experiences of that. Another very small point, I think the Council attaches too much weight to the Greenbelt purpose of avoiding sprawl. What the policy talks about is unrestricted sprawl. And the plan-led system itself will ensure that growth is regulated, so the plan itself, through its allocations, will prevent unrestricted sprawl. I agree with Mr Corsia that there are inconsistencies in the application of the criteria to the determination of greenbelt boundaries, obviously to be discussed later. Just a point he made recently about the designation of the retreat. Previously, from memory, I think it was in a previous iteration of the plan, it was described as an important part of a green wedge. So that's a fundamental change in an important element of greenbelt considerations. I don't see how it can be one thing one day and another thing the other. I've just had a nodded confirmation from a colleague down the table. I think that's about it, thank you. I think everything else I was going to say has been covered by other people.
Thank you for that. Mr Lyons, do you want to come in now or do you want to hold off?
Might as well come in now, sir, if that's okay. I'll check with Mr Wood if he has anything to say.
Thank you. I guess just try and deal with a few of Mr Collard's points. Try not to repeat points made earlier. It is a clarified methodology. We have taken the spatial shapers out. That's clearly explained. I go back again to table 5 in section 11 of the addendum, very clear on the points that have been acknowledged and the changes made. So I appreciate I've made that point already, and same again on the heritage assets. Point made about previously developed land. It's important that we need to look at the alignment of the Greenbelt approach with the overall spatial strategy approach, and as we've touched on already on Monday, the spatial strategy does look to make the best use of previously developed land, and all these exercises do come together. I'll
just put a marker down for when we discuss it. We are going to be quite interested to see what has or has not happened in relation to previously developed land and the Greenbelt boundary.
So the further points were made about the the starting point, that there's a presumption that the land is open. The key questions for all of the criteria are posed as questions. So if land isn't open, then the answer will be no. It's very clear on that. And then in terms of this issue about clarity, whether it's 19, 17, 16, 15, whatever number of questions, I think the point I would make is that those questions are very clearly set out in the methodology. They're set out there, whether you agree or disagree with them. But in terms of the approach that we've taken, you then turn to the annexes, and for all the sections of the Greenbelt boundaries, you see the answers to those questions on a yes-no basis, and you also see commentary on that. I appreciate there will be views about the actual responses, but in terms of an actual methodology that can be applied, it's been a very robust approach, and particularly that approach has been important so that you can get that consistency in the annexes and in the actual assessment work. So again, I accept there will be differences of views about the content of that, but as a process and a methodology, we don't think that could be much clearer. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that probably picks up as Worthington's points. Mr Collard, I'm not sure I need to say anything more beyond to say that clearly he's interested in Strensel, and that'll be something that we can cover at a later stage. As for the point by Ms Winter on the figures, we're not entirely sure where those figures have come from, and looking at the addendum, it's clear that obviously the trajectory that's being identified in the addendum has been updated since then. I'm just wondering, sir, if it's going to be useful for us to effectively recalculate the figures that were included in the addendum based on the current trajectory. Because basically it'll help deal with this point about safeguarding and the time beyond the plan period that's catered for in the headroom.
Yes, please.
And perhaps we can just deal with it that way. Thank you, sir.
Mr Wright.
Sir, I've spoken to Mrs. Crooks about the plans. She acknowledges that when I sent the hearing statements to her by email, I said there was a letter. She says that the letter goes to a PO box, and it appears that material might not have been collected. So what I have done is that I have delivered them to the architect shop up the road here, who are copying them now, but I don't think they'll be ready by this evening. So I don't know how to deliver them after that, because I don't want to send them